each other at lots of different meetings, so this is a little bit different situation, and I appreciate it. And I always enjoy coming out. I was actually out on Sunday fishing the better, so I can tell you that this is probably far more productive already tonight than my Sunday was. But it was nice to be out, and I see a few familiar faces here. So I'm with Watershed Watch Salmon Society. I'm not going to give you a long history of Watershed Watch. We're a small group. We have 5 employees and a few contractors that we hire. We deal with everything that affects salmon. So we'll talk about some of those interests as I go through, or I'll illustrate some that were at the Cohen inquiry. So the Cohen inquiry was a good smorgasbord for everything that could potentially affect salmon, and I'll tell you a little bit about the terms of reference as we go along. But I wanted to just give you a bit of a synopsis of how my typical day went from Coquitlam down to Vancouver for the Cohen inquiry. And has anybody seen that movie Groundhog Day with Bill Murray and Andy McDowell? I mean, that's kind of like where his day keeps repeating and repeating until he actually improves himself, and he has some revelation at the end, and he breaks out of his funk. That's sort of what the Cohen inquiry was for us, anyways. And Watershed Watch was part of what was called the Conservation Coalition. There were several groups in the Conservation Coalition, and we were represented by eco-justice lawyers at the Cohen inquiry. And they got a pretty handsome sum from the federal government for their participation. We got nothing. We had to, none of the participants got funded. We had to go out and raise our own funds. But that didn't deter us. We do have good support from the Moore Foundation out of California for wild salmon. And so my typical day, just so you know, was getting up and getting down to Logan SkyTrain station. I don't live very far from there. And getting on SkyTrain, which I love, because you can read and listen to music and do all that stuff, and actually prepare for meetings and things like that. And then we go down to the Granville station and walk across Granville Street up to West Georgia, and then that building around the corner of West Georgia and Granville is the federal court building. So you go in the elevator up to the 8th floor, and you go into the courtroom there where all this stuff happened. And there was about 350 seats where the audience could go, and usually most of them were empty except for the disease and aquaculture hearings. But you look up towards, the judge would be up there, he'd come in, of course, after everybody else was sitting down, and there would be a ring of lawyers for the 17 participant groups around there. So there'd be, the salmon farmers would have their lawyer, and the Department of Justice would have a couple of lawyers, and Cohen inquiry, they had like 17 lawyers that present different things. And there would be Greg McDade, Radcliffe & Company was representing Alex Morton on aquaculture issues. And there would be about 4 or 5 First Nations lawyers for various First Nations groups. And sometimes Rio Tinto's lawyers were there, most of the time not. But there'd be all these lawyers arrayed around there. And there'd be a procedure every day where you'd go in at 10 o'clock and the subject would be introduced wherever it was that day. And then the Cohen lawyers would get up and cross-examine the panel or witnesses or just start off on the subject. And then it would be the Department of Justice, the province, and the salmon farmers, and the conservationists. And then they'd go all day long. So we'd usually listen to testimony in the morning, and then we'd go out to lunch with our lawyers. And it was kind of interesting. Our lawyers were pretty good. One of them was a retired Crown prosecutor, and he decided to come back and work for eco-justice. And the other was an up-and-coming young lawyer with a Jewish background. And we always wanted to go out with lunch with the Crown prosecutor because he'd buy us lunch, but the other lawyer would never buy us lunch. Then we do our cross-examination, and then we go back to the court, and the cross-examination questions would be asked. So this is what it's all about. This is Judge Bruce Cohen. He doesn't really have a salmon background, and there's a long story how he got picked, and I'm not going to get into that now. I can talk to you about that a little bit later. But this was the first federal inquiry into the decline of any fish species in Canada. Now, we've had reviews, as people here probably know, on sockeye in the past. One was Justice Williams' review, and I was on that panel. And they didn't have the power of the Cohen inquiry. Cohen was appointed by the Prime Minister to investigate the decline of Fraser River sockeye. And they had 3 mandates, basically. One was to try and pinpoint the reasons why there was a decline. One was to make management recommendations on how to reverse the decline and improve management. And the third one was to partially find fault if there was somebody at fault for this whole thing. So that was kind of how the same worked. We participated in Watershed Watch for 18 months. Our biologist, Stan Probash, who's mostly an aquaculture biologist, was there almost every day. I was there quite a bit. So this was the big thing for us over the last 18 months when it was announced. So the writing was on the wall fairly early for the Cohen inquiry. If you look at these declines, it took a little while for people to recognize that the productivity, that's the ability of these fish to replace themselves. And there's many stocks of Fraser sockeye, right? So this is a collective group of Fraser sockeye, but their productivity declined dramatically since the early 1990s to the point where in 2009 we only had a handful over 1.5 million fish returning when we expected many more than that coming back. And 1.5 million sockeye for the entire Fraser is pretty bad. So something dramatic happened to those fish when they went out to sea as smolts in 2007, and that's a lot of what it was. But there was a lot of media attention on these really crashes of sockeye when they came back. We went to Watershed Watch, went with some of our colleagues and visited the Fisheries Minister, Gail Shea, before the inquiry. I don't think we had anything to do with it, by the way, in terms of having it called. But we expressed our concerns, and we deal with all kinds of salmon species, but the sockeye are central to BC. As a commercially viable fish, culturally, and quite an important sport fishery in the Fraser as well. So we had their attention, and Harper agreed to this inquiry with those 3 mandates and appointed Bruce Cohen. Now, a little bit about some specifics. The Cohen inquiry's mandate was extended once because they couldn't fit everything in there. It was a $25 million process. I lied. I said 17 winners. They only had 10 winners, so they kept it to a dull roar. But 20 participant groups, 17 quite active. There were 128 days of testimony, 181 witnesses. They had this huge database, and I'll talk a little bit about that we had to search for hours and hours on end to actually bring the evidence forward that we thought was important to the various subjects. And they covered anything that you might imagine, except maybe sunspots in terms of impacting Fraser sockeye. So what we would do is we go in and have interviews with their lawyers, and and others would too, and they look at the various subject groups like harvest and habitat, and then call expert witnesses. I was an expert witness on aquaculture impacts because I've been doing that for 12 years and published a few papers on salmon farm impacts, and also on water. That's another big subject that Watershed Watch works on. The final report is not due out until June 30th, and we're all waiting with bated breath and trying to see what happens. The inquiry, the physical part of the inquiry actually stopped last September, in the end of September, and all the evidence was in. And then, as you may have heard, there was some evidence of viruses emerging in Fraser sockeye, and the inquiry was open for 3 final days in December. So there hasn't been no testimony taken since the end of December. The Cohen inquiry has its own website. You can look it up. I think it's still there. They commission all kinds of reports, but they have all these categories about the reports and publications, the hearing dates, the Inquiries Act, terms of reference, everything like that. They have these alerts. And then they had all these public submissions. The public submitted all kinds of concerns and their views on what happened to Fraser sockeye. An overwhelming concern that came out in the public submission was salmon farming impacts. Over 70% of the people who actually said something to Cohen publicly were concerned about salmon farming impacts. That wasn't right up off the bat. They started going through all kinds of things and all. And I'm just going to cover a small portion of what actually happened at the Cohen inquiry. I mean, I know you're all dying to see the final report and read it page to page, but until that time, I'll just cover a few of the topics because, again, it went on for 18 months of testimony and hearings, so I'm not going to be able to cover it all. This is a snapshot. So some of the issues, to name a few, I've got a few words, but I'm trying to keep it fairly dull roar. One of the things that Watershed Watch is very concerned about is Canada's wild salmon policy. It came in fishing in 2005, and it pledges to preserve the biodiversity of wild salmon. Everybody that lives in this area knows that the river is warming, and it's warmed over 1.5 degrees in about 20 years. I mean, that's just amazing, and it's having an impact on sockeye, no doubt about it. Thermal stress, things like that. The wild salmon policy is trying to preserve biodiversity of these various stocks so that they can adapt to these kind of dramatic changes in water temperatures, things like that. Not all sockeye are created equal. Chilco sockeye are the super sockeye of the Fraser River. They have the biggest hearts, the best swimmers, highest temperature tolerances. So you got to look at the diversity of them. But what we were hearing is that senior management that the wild salmon policy wasn't being implemented. It was there, but it wasn't being implemented. And what we heard all the way through the Cohen inquiry was that wild salmon got about this much attention, and farm salmon got about this much attention, all the way through, and I'll provide some evidence of that. We also heard, very disturbing, that the no net loss policy, which is a good policy of DFO, isn't working. It's not being monitored properly, it's not being enforced properly. We're losing far more salmon habitat than we're saving through development and other things like that. Good policy, in practice, it's not really working. So these kind of things came out from senior habitat directors from Ottawa who came out to testify. There were assistant deputy ministers. And another thing that we heard is that the relationship between the province of British Columbia and DFO is in a state of dysfunction. These are actual quotes from testimony. There are transcripts from all of these hearings, and they're available. And that's really bad because the habitat in the province is managed by the province. Water, land, and they're supposed to coordinate with DFO, but we heard from several people in DFO and later as well, Jason Wong, who's a habitat biologist from Kamloops, that they don't even coordinate with the province and barely talk to them anymore about habitat issues, and that's extremely troubling. So these kind of things came up. We again saw testimony that that the wild salmon policy is just being delayed. It doesn't have a dedicated budget. They're going cap in hand every year to Ottawa asking for a budget for wild salmon policy. And that includes habitat monitoring and ecosystem monitoring too, which are really important if you're concerned about wild salmon. Here's evidence, Exhibit 120 from Pat Schnu, who's a former Regional Director General, Sioux Farlinger, the current RDG. He'd hope to get more of a commitment from the Minister to proceed with the wild salmon policy. No guarantees that we will score new resources. So again, he's just putting it very honestly on the table. These guys are supposed to be telling the truth, and there are penalties if you don't. So, but again, it was more of a bleak picture that we weren't paying attention to wild salmon. Now, I'm going to get back into the whole farm and wild salmon issue, but I just wanted to bring this one up. I think there was 2 days on the gravel extraction issue, and I know it's a big issue out here, and it's a big issue for a lot of us. Watershed Watch actually has a book on sturgeon reach coming out, and it's about gravel extraction written by Terry Glavin and Ben Parfit, so I'll contact Frank about that sometime. But the testimony was pretty interesting. You all probably know Michael Church. He blew away the notion that this was for flood control, right? It's not being done for flood control. And he was a very credible witness there, and some of his colleagues testified as well. And, it's not going to affect it, and it's going to significantly disrupt the aquatic ecosystem. So Cohen is listening very intently to all this. And this is really good testimony in terms of the habitat issues. And you all probably know Dr. Marvin Rosenau as well, LPCIT. He was an expert witness on gravel extraction, and it was just priceless watching the Department of Justice lawyer. He wanted to trap him, and so he thought he was really clever, and he said to Marvin, he said, "Now Harrison sockeye are doing quite well, aren't they, Dr. Rosenau?" And Marvin said, "Yeah, they're exception, they're doing quite well." And he said, "Well, that's evidence that gravel extraction is not hurting Fraser sockeye, right?" Marvin said, "Well, you got to consider that the Harrison comes out below where the gravel extraction is happening." And that lawyer was just so deflated, he just went back and sat down. he had nothing after that, right? But that's how, so the Department of Justice and the province and the salmon farmers, they were working in lockstep. They were outside talking about questions and testimony and everything all the way through this. And they're trying to portray DFO regulators in a very, very good light, and that was their job all the way through. But very interesting discussion on this and other habitat issues.